Can I have a look?
Okay, we are already at the 3, 2, 1.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Wisaweisuan School of Development Studies talk, which is regularly organized to share the publications and knowledge on development studies. Today, I'm very pleased that and it's also honored that we have Professor Ian Coxhead with us. And he is here, Professor Ian Coxhead, who is economist, specializing in the study of growth, trade, and development with a regional concentration in East and Southeast Asia. He'll be with us to give the presentation and also discuss with all of you at home on the topic of the schooling consequences of an FDI boom in Vietnam. This is one of the platforms that I think you will find. I hope that you will find the inspiring issues for the further development studies, research, as well as those who are interested in the policy making process to learn from Ian. Before we start, allow me to give you some introduction so that we get to know Ian Coxhead. Ian's primary research focus is on the implications of globalization and global market shocks on employment, earnings, migration, and educational choices in developing economies. His broader research interests include interaction between trade, development, natural resources, and the environment. He has published widely in peer-reviewed economics journals and was editor of the Handbook of Southeast Asian Economics in 2015, and also co-author of the Open Economy and the Environment, Development, Trade, and Resources in Asia in 2003. And Ian has been traveling to many countries, lived in a number of countries, particularly in Southeast Asia. He has also taught in Philippines, Thailand, Japan, and of course at Thammasat University a number of years ago. He has been with us with the Faculty of Economics. So he has a lot of collaboration with the universities in the Southeast Asia, and particularly in the Vietnam and Indonesia as well. Ian Coxhead received the PhD in economics from the Australian National University in 1990. And he joined University of Wisconsin, Madison, Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics in 1991. And then he was the department chair from 2012 to 2017. And at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, he has also served as the director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. So we have a very great honor that now Ian is with us, and I think this is a great chance for the PSDS as well to have him sharing his research and knowledge on what he has done. And today he will speak about schooling consequences of an FDI boom in Vietnam. So ladies and gentlemen, everyone who are present here and also at home, now please welcome Professor Ian Coxhead with us. Good morning.
Good morning, Nitinant. Thank you very much for that nice introduction.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully everything will work just fine. Is that okay? You can see.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Very nice.
Yeah. So good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be here. It's very nice to be in Thailand. In fact, it's my first trip to go anywhere at all in 2 years. So this is a very nice choice for me. When I taught at Thammasat many years ago, my research was mainly on the Southeast Asian economies, especially at that time, Thailand. Now, most of my work in Southeast Asia is in Vietnam, but it turns out that what I learned by studying Thailand is very relevant to what I learned by studying Vietnam. And the two economies have many similarities. If the audience is interested in those comparisons, then after the end of my formal talk about Vietnam, I'll be very happy to talk about some of those things. But for today, I want to talk about an FDI boom in Vietnam and the consequences of that. My interest in this is because we know that in order to sustain long-run economic development, countries have to invest in human capital. They have to send their children to school and keep them in school. And if they're successful in doing that, then they have a better chance of success in long-run economic growth and development. If they have trouble with schooling, then they get into a problem of not enough skills, and it's difficult to sustain long-run economic growth. And I think that Vietnam is at a very interesting point in its development with respect to this. So here are some data. These are very squiggly looking lines. But what they show on the vertical axis is average years of education in the population or in the workforce. And on the horizontal axis, the log of per capita income. So if we take any vertical line in this diagram, then we can compare countries at the same level of per capita income and look at differences in schooling attainment. And Vietnam here is shown as an orange line. Starts a long way to the left because Vietnam was very poor in the early 1990s, and then it extends to the right. And what that shows us is the relationship between economic growth, growth of per capita income, and increases in the schooling attainment of the workforce as well. And what we see, especially if we compare Vietnam in orange with Indonesia, the yellow line, or Thailand, the blue line with little round dots, is that all three of these countries have rapid economic growth, but that their schooling attainment kind of peaks at around an average of 8 years schooling in the workforce, which is a little different to the experience of countries like Korea or Japan or even Malaysia, which have attained much higher average levels of schooling in the population. So that's background, and we can certainly come back to these numbers a little bit later on. The current challenges for Vietnam are as follows. It's undergone a lot of economic reforms. Those reforms have been very successful, and Vietnam has grown very quickly. But then the schooling attainment in the population, I'm sorry, I'm turning on my timer. I forgot to do that, so I'm going to do it now. Okay. Schooling attainment in the population has also been very successful in terms of increasing the numbers of children in school and the level of schooling that they attain, but things are starting to level off. So the first diagram that I'm showing you here is one in which we can see that from the early 1990s until about the middle of the last decade, there was a big increase in average schooling enrollment rates for girls, for boys, for primary school and for lower secondary school. But for upper secondary school, we can see that after about 2005, 2006, the percentage of children remaining in secondary school leveled off at about 70%, roughly speaking, for boys and for girls, and has even gone down a little bit for boys over the last decade. So this is a concern. It's one thing to finish compulsory education, that's primary education and lower secondary school up to 9th grade. But at 9th grade, children are turning 15, then they can work in the, legally work in the labor force, and then they begin to face competition from the labor demand versus staying in school. And this has been an issue in Vietnam. We can, I'm sorry, let me, I'm having trouble advancing my slide. Why is that?
Cannot move?
Let me check. Okay, here we are. Yep. So the second table that I put up here has some information relevant to this. On the right-hand column that's shaded in green, we can see recent year changes in the wage for different levels of education. By far, the highest increase in wages during that period was for less than high school graduates. So workers in the labor force whose education is less than 9th grade or up to 9th grade. The increase in wages for other, of course, the levels of wages for other categories are higher, but the wage growth rate has been much lower over that time. And if we look at the yellow shaded area, this is the wage premium, that is the difference in earnings for high school graduates versus those with less than high school education. And we can see that that wage premium has fallen pretty substantially over the period from 2002 to 2016. So that the additional gain in earnings that you can capture by attending high school and completing high school has diminished during this time. That's what I'm going to call the skill premium or the wage premium. So this is clearly a problem because if the returns to additional education are not rising or even are falling, then the incentive for students to stay in school is also lower. So that's what this project addresses. We think we're interested in the labor demand side influences on schooling attainment. And in particular, since Vietnam has experienced a very big boom in foreign direct investment, creating lots of blue collar jobs in factories, then we want to know, is there an important role for FDI in explaining these educational trends? And if so, what, if anything, can policymakers do about this? That's what I'll talk about for the first few minutes here. Okay, so some background. This grid diagram shows the percentage increase in annual earnings for students based on years of education. So this tells us for each additional year of education, how much more a student can expect to earn in the labor force. There are two sets of estimates, but they show us they're based on different econometric methodologies, but they show us essentially the same story, which is that from the 1990s through to about 2008, that is just after Vietnam joined the WTO, we can see that the returns to additional years of schooling rose. And then after that, up to 2014 at least, they fell by about 40%, which is a very big drop in additional returns to schooling. We can see that this turning point around about 2006 to 2008 coincides with some very big macroeconomic trends in Vietnam. Joining the WTO meant much lower tariffs on all key sectors in the Vietnamese economy. So the economy opened up to trade, and in doing so, many sectors expanded and other sectors contracted. The sectors which expanded were the ones which were intensive in the use of low-skilled labor, because Vietnam is abundant in low-skilled labor. The sectors which contracted were the ones that initially had the highest protection through tariffs, and they were more capital-intensive and more skill-intensive. They haven't done so well. The right-hand side shows us trends in foreign direct investment inflows to Vietnam. We can see that around the time of WTO accession, 2007, there was a very big surge in FDI inflows. Then it kind of took a pause for a while during the global financial crisis. And then in about 2014, it began to rise again very, very sharply. And we're going to focus on that last period, that last rise, starting after the global financial crisis. In terms of jobs created, here is the story. So from the early 2000s through to WTO accession in 2006, 2007, 2008, we get a big spike in FDI jobs created, then a pause, and then in 2014 and subsequent years, very, very big increases in the number of FDI jobs created in the Vietnamese economy. So the FDI sector, the foreign invested sector, companies like Samsung, for example, have been the key creators of new jobs in manufacturing in the Vietnamese economy. But of course, job growth is not limited to FDI, and estimates in other countries indicate that for every FDI job created, there are around about 4 additional jobs created in service sector activities: construction, transport, trade, local trade, housing, personal services, all of those kinds of activities. And actually, job growth has been much faster in those activities than in the FDI sector itself. And one thing to remember about those jobs is most of them in the service sector are very low-skilled jobs in informal entities, family-owned businesses or single entrepreneur businesses with very low tech and therefore very low demands in terms of educational attainment as well. That's where most of the new graduates from the schooling system are going when they join the labor force. Okay, so let's step back and think about this in a kind of a theoretical way for a few moments. When a country like Vietnam now, or indeed Thailand in the 1980s and 90s, joins the global value chain, we know that there are big changes in relative product prices because of trade liberalization. And we know that these inflows of foreign capital change the endowment structure of the economy as well. Big injections of new capital into specific kinds of industries where the country has comparative advantage. This in turn changes the demand for skills and for low-skill labor as well. If the country specializes in low-skill activities, then the demand for blue-collar labor rises faster than the demand for other forms of labor. And that's, I think, what we're seeing in Vietnam at the moment. In addition to that, of course, incomes also rise. And that's really important because as household incomes rise, then households spend more on education for their children. They want to keep their children in school longer. And we have, therefore, contradictory influences. Income growth means more demand for education for children, but growth of blue-collar labor demand means a higher opportunity cost of schooling. The longer I stay in school, the more I give up in terms of current earnings, and also faster growth of blue-collar employment or blue-collar labor demand and lower skill premium means a lower return over my lifetime to investments in education as well. So there are forces operating in both directions here. As a result of joining the global value chain, incomes go up, that's good for educational demand, but demand for blue-collar labor goes up, that's bad for incentives to stay in school. This is really important not only at the household and individual level and not only in the current period, but also for the long term, because if long-term success in economic development is based on accumulating skills in the labor force, then what we see is that for a country that is specializing in low-skill blue-collar activities, there may be a dynamic which says that as they specialize in those activities, then the labor market increasingly rewards blue-collar activities. Then the incentives to stay in school don't rise very fast, and the country becomes even more specialized over time in blue-collar activities. And so this, I think, is a slightly scary prospect for a country like Vietnam, because it means that without some serious policy intervention, it may be that the rate of growth of human capital, the accumulation of skills through the education system, might become quite slow over time. And this is a concern. So we have this kind of set of contradictory effects. Turns out Vietnam is not unique in that respect. And the global literature on globalization and schooling comes up with a lot of different kinds of findings. They're not consistent. Some big multi-country studies that find that countries which specialize in low-skill, labor-intensive activities have lower rates of growth of schooling attainment. And then individual country studies or studies which look at individual issues within this also have contradictory findings. So trade liberalization in schooling, some studies find positive effects, others negative effects. Trade liberalization and the skill premium, again, some positive, some negative effects. FDI injections and schooling, also mostly negative effects, including some work that I've done in the past, also in Vietnam. So we don't really know what this globalization experience is going to do in terms of long-run accumulation of human capital. Okay, so here's a little econometric model. This is a model which says that the choice that an individual makes, a student, between staying in school after age 15 or leaving and joining the labor force has a number of factors influencing it. So think about the group of students who are old enough to work, but also young enough that they could still be in the school system. So 15 to 18 years old is about the right age group for that, right? Of course, if their family income in this model here is higher, then the household will want to invest more in their schooling. So that should have a positive effect. If the low skill wage rises, the blue collar wage, that should have a negative effect. That will draw them out from school sooner and into the labor force. If the skill premium is higher, then that would encourage them to stay in school for longer. But we've seen that the skill premium may not rise during this time. And then there are other factors like the cost of schooling, of course, the direct cost of schooling, and then demographic factors, the sex of the child, the age of the child, the location in which they live, so the quality of the school that they can attend, for example, these are all factors as well. So this is a model which helps us empirically to sort out the effect of labor demand from other factors which influence the schooling or the school work decision. And as we saw in the previous literature, there's no clear evidence one way or the other about which way the schooling decision will be affected by things like wages and the skill premium. So we want to take this to the data in Vietnam. And we do that with several rounds, almost a decade of labor force survey data. A very big survey, about 800,000 individuals each year. And out of that, we look at the 15 to 18-year-old group and we ask, are they in school or not? If they're not in school, what are they doing? What are they earning? What are the influences on their decision ex post? Okay, so some data. I won't talk about all of these data, but the left-hand diagram shows us trends in the labor force survey data in the real wage earned by different skill levels. We've got two definitions of skills here. One is based on completing middle school, so grade 9. So in that case, the skilled wages for anyone who got education grade 10 and above versus low skill wage grade 9 and below. And the other definition is the same but for grade 12. So completing grade 12 or failing to complete grade 12. But as you can see, the data show very similar trends in both cases. And what we see is that matching that very big surge in FDI that started in 2013-14 and the big growth in FDI jobs that came along in 2014, we can see that the low skill wage started to rise much more quickly than the high skill wage, according to either definition, right in 2014. If we look at the right-hand side diagram, that's the skill premium under either definition, and we can see really spectacular decline in the skill premium also in 2014. And when my student and I, my co-author and I, on this paper first looked at these data, we didn't believe them. We thought these numbers are just too big, the changes are too big, and so probably it's a mistake or it's something weird about the data. I won't go into details, but if we break the data down from annual to quarterly, we find confirmation that we didn't make a mistake. These are real numbers that we're looking at here. Okay, so then we do what's called event study analysis. Basically, we take a very naive approach and we just say, is there any significant difference year to year in the variables that we're looking at here? And if there is, we're going to be able to measure that with the data that we're using. So we control for different provinces. We control for different years. And then we ask if the variable, the outcome variable we're interested in shows any different trend. And here's what, I'll skip over that. Here's what we find. So the provincial average FDI employment share jumps up after 2014 and becomes significantly different from the base year, 2011, by 2015 and onwards. So a clear significant trend, upward trend in FDI employment during this time, following the 2014 injection of new foreign direct investment. So what about the labor market? Well, the left-hand side shows us manufacturing sector skill premium. And again, relative to 2011, not much difference through to 2014. And then after that, a very big drop in the skill premium. The right-hand side shows the same thing for service sector activity. So if we think that every one FDI job creates 4 or so service sector jobs, then we can see the influence of this, the same trend in the service sector jobs. And these are significantly lower skill premium. So the signal is, if you stay in school longer, then the expected additional return is going to be less as a result. And then here are net enrollment rates. And I'm going to show you this quickly and then another diagram more slowly. These show us, again, relative to 2011, that in percentage point terms, 2012, 13, 14, there was about a roughly 4 to 5% higher enrollment rate in by 15 to 18-year-olds. And in 2015, a big drop. And then the same trend resumed, but not an increasing trend, just flat relative to earlier years. So basically, the growth in school enrollments from 2012 all the way through to 2018, about the same. Not an increase, just a higher level than 2011, but not growing relative to that. And I want to spend a moment with this. This is a bit difficult to read, but it's really rewarding, I think. So these two diagrams look at all the workers in the labor force in 2019. And so we have different cohorts of workers in the labor force based on the year in which they completed high school. These are their birth cohorts. So we add in the left-hand side diagram for those who finished up to 9th grade, we add about 14 years to see where they were when they entered the labor force in terms of education. On the right-hand side, upper secondary, we add about 16 years to that number. And what we see on the left-hand side is that the educational attainment of Vietnam's labor force began to rise very, very sharply in the early reform years, so that somebody born in, let's say, 1980 or thereabouts, graduating from 9th grade in about 1994, at the beginning of the Vietnam reform period, we can see that there was a lot of additional education created during those first generation or so of reforms. And that after 2014, our FDI surge, those numbers continue to increase. So this is like a falsification test, right? Because these are people entering the labor force with grade 9 or less education. That means that when they're in school, deciding what to do, they're too young to join the labor force. And so income effects should be the most important effects for these students, and we can see that income effects are probably driving the increase in educational attainment even after the FDI boom. But on the right-hand side, we've got high school graduates, and so for them, income effects are important, but labor demand is also important. And we can see that after 2014, the average educational attainment by cohort declines during this time. So 15 to 18-year-olds are entering the labor force with statistically lower levels of educational attainment during those years, which I think if I was a Vietnamese policymaker looking at this, I would be really scared. Okay, maybe, well, I have only one table of econometric results. I can't resist talking about it, okay? So econometrically, we ask whether there is any significant influence from FDI employment shares on the variables that we're interested in, that is the wage premium or the opportunity cost of schooling as measured by the low skill wage. The first two columns here show us the results for wage premium under the two different definitions that we had, 9th grade or 12th grade. And what we can see is that after we control for different years and different provinces, the the effect of an increase in foreign invested jobs has no statistical effect on the skill premium. So the point estimate is positive, but the standard error is very large, so it's a zero effect. When we look in the third and fifth column, we're looking at, in each case, the effect of the FDI employment growth on the low skill wage, the blue collar wage by each definition. And we can see there a significant positive effect. Right? It's also positive for the high skill wage, but the relative growth is much greater for the low skill wage than the high skill wage. Bottom line of the table shows that. So the bottom line shows us the effect of the FDI employment share increase relative to the baseline wage in each category. And so for those who are only completing or up to completing lower secondary education up to 9th grade, the effect of the FDI share increase or employment increase on wage is much larger for low skilled workers than for high skilled workers. And in the case of 12th grade, it's somewhat larger for low skilled workers relative to high skilled workers. So all of this is confirming for us that increasing the number of FDI jobs in the economy is having a pretty big influence on decisions to remain in school through the labor market effect. See that the camera has fallen down. Is that important or not? Maybe not. Okay. All right. So I see. Okay. But the screen is still sharing, right? Okay, that's fine. Yeah, good. So just to wrap up really quickly, if we think about the possible effects of FDI on school enrollments, other studies that I've done with other collaborators show that the more FDI jobs, the lower the rate of school enrollment among 15 to 18-year-olds. And if we look at this by socioeconomic status, then we get another pretty interesting result. And that is that during the decade of very rapid economic growth, 2006 to 2016, we see that on the right-hand side, school enrollments and high school enrollments and tertiary enrollments for children from wealthy families, the top 20% of families, continue to increase very dramatically. But that on the left-hand side, school enrollments, especially after age 15, by children from the poorest families did not increase at all. So not only is there a kind of an aggregate effect in the economy, but that effect is differentiated between lower income or lower socioeconomic status households and higher socioeconomic status households. So there's another kind of story going on here, and that is that if your household is wealthy, then you're going to send your children to school no matter what. And a change in the wage or the skill premium is not going to influence that decision. You're going to send your kids to school because it's the right thing to do and your family can afford it. But if we look at poorer households, then they are influenced by the labor market, of course. And what we're seeing here, I think, is evidence that among the poorer households where the decision about schooling or work is a real economic decision, there hasn't been a lot of improvement in educational attainment rates. And this is where the real effect is coming from, not from the whole labor market or the whole school system, but from, of course, from those who are in the lower part of the income distribution. Okay. I could go on and talk about that, but I want to kind of wrap up the story that I've told so far, and then we can have questions. Okay.
Yes.
So what I've showed you so far is that there was a very big shock, a very big increase in FDI inflows to the Vietnamese economy, and starting in 2014 and continuing for several years after that. And coincident with that, we see very big changes in labor market variables, the skill premium, the low skill wage, and indeed in school enrollments as well. Now, we don't have really rock solid evidence that one is causing the other, right? We think that it's likely that that's the case, but we can't absolutely claim that that's the case. But I'm going to say where there's smoke, there's fire, right? So that the big change in FDI, which is of course beyond the control of households or firms or others in the economy, is associated with big changes in the variables that influence schooling decisions by poorer households. Okay, so it looks like this very big surge in FDI in the Vietnamese economy has raised the opportunity cost of schooling, thus discouraging students at the lower part of the income or ability distribution from remaining in school. No big positive effect on the skill premium. And that seems to be an economically meaningful magnitude as well. So what to do? Well, let's look ahead. First of all, we want to think about enrollment rates. So I've showed you a little bit of those data. We want to think about heterogeneity among households. That seems to be important. And we want to think about whether what we see in Vietnam might also be interesting or important in other countries as well. So let me jump forward a little bit and just tell you part of that story about what I think is interesting in Thailand, since this is a Thai audience, right? Okay, so I'm going to jump forwards a few steps here. Okay, so remember in the start, I showed you this diagram here, which shows us the relation or the correlation between income growth and school attainment. And what we noticed there was that for Indonesia in yellow and Thailand, this blue line here, we get increases over time in schooling corresponding to growth in education. But these numbers start to level out at around about 8 years of schooling on average for the whole population. And that leveling out is, of course, at a level much lower than in, say, Korea or any other Northeast Asian country. So there's lots of scope for additional educational attainment that doesn't appear to be showing up in the data. Why would that be? Well, turns out that in Thailand, we have the same kind of story as in Vietnam. That is, the estimated returns to additional years of education in Thailand are also very low. That is, there's lots of demand for blue collar or low medium skilled work, but the returns, unless you go to college, the returns to additional education up to about 12th grade are not that high, which I think is pretty telling, right? In terms of incentives for Thai students to remain in the school system. We can see that a little bit in these trends based on the Thai labor force survey. We see here that enrollment rates by cohort of students haven't really changed over time. So all the way from 1996 to 2019, we see essentially the same pattern of declining school enrollments with age. There hasn't been a big shift in that pattern. So it doesn't look like something is changing in Thailand that would reflect additional investments in education over time. This is quite a long period of time over which to see the same pattern of decline in school enrollments. What does all this mean in broader terms? Well, on the left-hand side, we see that over time, economies in Southeast Asia have become much more engaged with the global economy. On the right-hand side, which shows us the ratio of skilled to unskilled labor in the value added of exports, no trend, right? That is, from 1995 to 2011, a pretty long period of time in modern economic development, we see that there hasn't been any measurable increase in the skill intensity of exports from countries like Thailand or even Malaysia or Vietnam at all. So not much evidence that there's been sustained accumulation of human capital translating into more skill-intensive activities as far as participation in the global value chain is concerned. And I think this is a policy problem. So let me finish here. When we talk about education policy, Usually we're thinking about the Ministry of Education, but the mandate of the Ministry of Education is very much about supply side. Teachers, curriculum, schools, all of those kinds of things. And all of those things are very important. But what we're learning here, I think, from the Vietnamese experience, is that the demand side also matters a great deal. And if the demand for skills doesn't match education policy mandates, then we have to do something else about it, not just build more schools and hope that students will show up. Right? So if education really does sustain long-run economic growth, what kind of policies should we be thinking about? The first one is, what I've showed, I think, is that for many students, exiting school at 15 or 16 is a rational decision, right? What they're going to gain by staying in school won't be enough to cover the additional cost of doing that. So we need to invest in ability, that is, make much more investment in early childhood health and nutrition and education so that children can get more out of the school system going through to age 15 and beyond. I think that's very important. Second, we know that increasing school supply and access to schools is very important. There have been some very famous studies that address that kind of thing. But we also know that those effects are rather small. And the magnitude of the FDI effects in Vietnam is much bigger than the effects that have been measured in empirical studies of increased investments in the supply of schooling. So something else to think about, I think, there. And then lastly, heterogeneous shocks. Obviously, socioeconomic status is a very important variable in this. And so inequality comes into the mix, right? And if we can address inequality, maybe we can help more students from lower SES households to gain both the ability and the motivation that they need to remain in school longer. And that will have a very big macroeconomic effect. That's what I wanted to say. So I'll stop there and welcome any questions.
Thank you very much. And I think we learned a lot from the experience of Vietnam. And also thanks for sharing your opinions and recommendations for Thailand as well. I do agree that the labor market is truly heterogeneous. And at the moment, I think looking at the number of years in school or having the performance in school is really not enough, and perhaps not suiting the ongoing situations in a globalization. So you mentioned about heterogeneity of the labor market and also a number of skills that are specifically demanded by different industries. Maybe you have done some research over there, or in your opinion, what do you think about the skills specific in terms of promoting the FDI? Because at the moment we are talking a lot about the 21st skills, 21st century skills. And all countries in the world are adapting that kind of fashion. And we are promoting lifelong learning as well.
Right.
But I'm sure that there will be skills specific required by different industries in the world, and taking into account of the global value chain that can stimulate FDI. Then do you have any idea about the shape of this change in the future, particularly for the Southeast Asia countries?
Yeah, that's a big question. You're right. So I have some ideas, but I don't know if I have a coherent single idea, right? Yeah. The first thing is, so the data from Vietnam show us what happens when a very labor abundant country with relatively little overall educational attainment joins the global labor force, right? Foreign investors that come in are looking for one thing and one thing only, that is, they want cheap, disciplined workers, right? And so the biggest investor and the biggest exporter in Vietnam is Samsung Industries, right? They produce, as you know, mobile phone parts and components and completed devices as well. And while their industry is counted as a high-tech industry, the skills that they demand of Vietnamese workers are not high-tech skills. They are really the ability to work for in a very consistent way, doing some very limited set of tasks for a long period of time. So those kinds of skills are not taught in school.
No, of course not.
Yeah. Policy-wise, what to do about that? Is there any kind of industrial policy addendum to the globalization experience that might help that? The Vietnamese government and Samsung have cooperated on that. And so Samsung every year invests additional billions of dollars in new factories in Vietnam. And then a few years ago, they announced that they were going to also build an R&D center, right? And the R&D center would supposedly engage in much higher skilled kinds of activities and therefore kind of fill in some of this upper level skill requirements in the total labor force that they employ. I don't believe that this is a real thing. I think that Samsung is doing this to keep the Vietnamese government happy, that they're not really that interested in establishing an R&D center in Vietnam because Vietnam has no comparative advantage in that area. And the kinds of activities that would happen in that unit are already happening in Korea, right? And in other satellite locations around the world where the skill set is appropriate to that kind of activity. So I think this is I think that the number one thing that you mentioned, which is what's the sort of breakdown of skills and how do we influence that? I think that's a very hard problem.
Yes.
Yeah. Thailand, of course, has something similar, right? So Thailand's industries, even the automobile industry, has a range of skill demands.
Yes.
But, the numbers that I see for the Thai auto industry, that most of the growth has taken place in kind of relatively low skill, backward linkage type activities. And so the auto industry remains mostly focused on assembly and not on the kinds of activities that would demand higher skills. Is there a policy solution to that? It's not clear, not so clear.
Right.
Yeah.
And if the situation goes on like this, I think it's very difficult, particularly for developing countries, to catch up with the developed countries as well, because the skills demand and the skills supplied by different countries, particularly in Vietnam and in other South Asian countries, we still have low skills. And how could that be possible for them to earn higher and reduce the income gap between countries?
Yes.
Because it widens the income inequalities between countries. That's my own opinion.
It may do. That's right. Yeah. And, I think Southeast Asia is in a very interesting position here because there isn't any good precedent for what's going to happen in this region of the world. If we look at Korea or Japan or Taiwan, these are countries which industrialized and grew when the world economy was totally different, right? And the conditions that they face in the world markets that they faced back then are not replicated today. So that Thailand or Vietnam or Indonesia can't expect to have the same kind of experience that happened in Korea. And I think this means that we're kind of feeling our way here because we don't really know what's going to happen next. And this is even more so the case because now, of course, China is very big. China has very deliberate policies to deepen and extend its own domestic supply chain in manufacturing. And that means that there's a lot of explicit government support within China for the kinds of industries that used to be areas of comparative advantage in countries like Thailand. And I think this is another challenge that we don't really know how it's going to play out. Sorry to sound so pessimistic.
But we are thinking about on the basis of the fact, actually, not the pessimistic. And can you please stop sharing?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And I think what Ian has proposed to all of us from his own opinion suggests something about the university industry engagement. I think at the moment we promote a lot of the education with the linkage, right, between university and the industries. Perhaps in a very near future, such the engagement has to go down to school level, perhaps, because the sooner the better. Thing is, the sooner they have skills trained, the better that they can become professional sooner. Are there any questions from the floor, from the audience who are present here in the meeting room of the School of Development Studies? If there are any questions, please feel free to to raise.
Okay, so thank you very much for your nice presentation.
So you can be the camera too. Okay, so, so for the audience at home will see us. Yes, okay. Yes, we have Dr. Giriya Kunpalakan from School of Development Studies. She'd like to share. Okay. Oh, yes, yes, please.
So your paper can kind of show us that the FDI boom is kind of had a negative impact on inequality in Vietnam, right? In terms of education and income. What is the situation of inequality in Vietnam right now? I mean, in Thailand, inequality in Thailand it's bad. So I'm just curious, what's the situation of inequality in Vietnam? That's my first point.
Yeah.
And like, do you think that Thailand, Vietnam will face the middle income trap? Like,
Yeah.
what happened in Thailand?
Yeah.
Right. It seems like your paper trying to kind of towards in that point.
Yeah.
And you are saying that maybe we should try to stop them from quitting school, right? But that's going to lower the number of workers, cheap workers in Vietnamese labor market. So Vietnam will gonna lose their competition, right? In that. So in the short term, at least in the short period of time, right? It's good for them in the long run.
Yeah.
Where they're gonna have like higher human capital, which is good for their competitiveness in the future.
Yeah.
In the short run, it's maybe it's a good trade-off. They're gonna maybe lose their competitiveness.
Right.
Yeah. And my last question is, did your paper touch any like the aspect of like field of study, like the FDI boom has effect on field of study?
Yeah.
Like,
Another lecture from the whole questions.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So in the future, we kind of require students to take more technology, or engineering, or science, like not social science.
Yeah.
Like in Thailand, we have that problem.
Right.
We have a mismatch in our labor market. So maybe like your paper touch at all on the like field of study.
I see. Okay, four very interesting questions. Thank you. Let me take them in a different order. First, field of study. No, we haven't looked at that. We're using labor force survey data, and so that data set doesn't allow us to identify the field of study, only the level of education attained. It's very coarse in that respect. So that's a really interesting question, and one that would need a very different kind of data set to address. Okay. About your third question, that is the trade-off or possible trade-off between keeping children in school and diminishing the rate of growth of workers entering the labor force. Yeah, that's possibly a problem. I'm going to guess that, well, it's clear that that has an upside and a downside, right? The downside is children stay in school longer, there are fewer new workers joining the labor force. The upside is when they do join the labor force, they have better skills, right? And so maybe that changes the composition of FDI coming into the country. So for example, in Vietnam, it's not all assembling mobile phones for Samsung. There are other things as well. For example, Hollywood animation studios use a lot of Vietnamese animators. And, there's an increasingly large industry based in coding, software writing, back office type support for software and so on. And so maybe that kind of industry will expand faster if the supply of graduates from upper levels of schooling increases. So that's a trade-off, I think. I will say, however, that that kind of trade-off that you're thinking about, like how many students stay in school a year or two longer, is probably very small relative to the demographic context, which is that the growth of population in Vietnam is collapsing, just like in Thailand, right? So women are not having babies anymore, or they're having very few babies. They're delaying them, they're spacing them further apart. And so demographically, that force will be much greater than anything that comes from keeping children in school a few years longer. That's the bigger problem, I think. Of course, Thailand has been facing this for quite a long time already. Middle income trap, scary. I don't know what to say. Let's talk about inequality. FDI and inequality. So the first thing is FDI creates thousands and thousands of jobs, both in the industrial parks and outside them in construction and services. And so that's really good for income, especially at the lower levels of the socioeconomic status. And that by itself reduces inequality, especially when workers migrate to those jobs and then send remittances home, so that the gains from that kind of growth are spread very broadly through the economy. So that effect, I think, is very positive. The two things where we worry, first of all, on the educational side, the thing that I described about unequal incentives and unequal access to educational opportunities. Second thing is that if you come from a community that is not linked into the migrant labor market, then you have very limited opportunity to gain from that. So think about Vietnam's ethnic minority population, about 15% of the population. They don't have those kind of networks, or at least up till now they don't. So it's just not that easy for someone who is from an ethnic minority group like the Hmong, for example, to join the industrial labor force. They don't have cousins living in the city where they can go and stay while they get a job. They don't have all of those kinds of networks. And so they're getting increasingly far behind. And so when you talk about inequality, the most important dimension of inequality that's increasing in Vietnam is between those who can and do access the new economy and those who cannot or do not access the new economy. And increasingly, that divide is exactly matched with ethnic majority and ethnic minority populations. That's a very big source of concern.
I think we have talked a lot about skills in the industries and also FDI related sectors. But we might have to look at the fundamental of the economies, particularly when we look at the problem of food security as an example. So I think we haven't talked about the skills required in agriculture sector or the food processing business. I think this is quite a little bit being ignored by not only policymakers, but also in academics as well. So what do you think about this in terms of the skills development, particularly in the to secure the food and the environment for development, for sustainable development?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Nitinant. I don't know so much about this. I think that what we see, especially from countries like Thailand, is that there's a lot of potential for increasing value added from agriculture if the right kind of entrepreneurial environment exists and the right kind of policy environment and the right kind of physical infrastructure like cold chains, marketing networks, that kind of thing. So I would guess that food security in the most fundamental sense of just availability of food is not threatened by these kinds of trends, especially in countries like Thailand and Vietnam, which are net food exporters anyway. I would say that the transformation of agriculture, accompanying this much more broad economic transformation, if if it's supported in the right way, can be quite successful. So the rest of the world would like to eat more tropical fruit, right? Would like to eat more seafood, would like to eat higher value products that are derived from those things. And countries like Thailand and Vietnam are well positioned, of course, to do that, if indeed they have the infrastructure and the policy environment and the entrepreneurial capacity to undertake that. So I'm optimistic about that to the extent that I know anything about it. I don't think food security is a problem. I do think that maintaining the dynamism of agriculture requires looking for higher value added activities for that sector.
So perhaps the development would require, would need more balance, the balanced training on the skills and the education in school as well.
Yeah, I think that's going to be true everywhere, right across the labor force. And even though I've made a lot of noise about lower returns to education, they're still positive. And I think with the right dynamic, that is, with increasing value added in a sector like agriculture, then it's not impossible to think about increasing opportunities for high skill engagement in that sector, especially with automation, right? And especially with the increasing sophistication of products. So there's a complementarity between product sophistication, the range of products you produce, and the amount of value added represented by those products, and the educational input that is optimal for the production of those things. So, there's potential for a virtuous circle of investments in skills and education and increasing product sophistication, leading to, in turn, to greater demand for skills as well. How to get onto that particular treadmill, I think, is the real challenge.
It's a great challenge, particularly for our country as well. So, are there any other questions? Any questions or comments from home? Let me have a look and see that. All right. Okay. So I think yes, okay. Oh, can I have a look at that, please? You send me through the lines, and then I can read the questions from home, right?
So not in the chat, but somewhere else, right?
From Facebook. All right, from Facebook. From Facebook, I don't know who, but that is a question for you. In Southeast Asia, we see the trends on more educational attainment in many countries, but we are trapped by, as middle-income countries, as you mentioned as well. I am curious about the labor market. Is there enough jobs for people in Vietnam? Are there enough jobs for people in Vietnam? If the minimum wage labor is still low, will the high educated people want to migrate out of the country?
Oh. Okay.
Thank you for the question. Yes.
I thought I was going to escape talking about middle income trap. So let's confront middle income trap. Okay. I don't believe there's anything called a middle income trap, because the idea of a trap is something that says that there's no growth happening, right? Of course there's growth happening. It's the rate of growth that matters. So there's a sort of middle income challenge, I don't know if we can call it that, which says that you can't expect to continue growing rapidly by doing the same thing that you did before. You've got to change. Right. And so I think that challenge is about, and Thailand faces this right now. Vietnam is increasingly about to face this.
Yes.
That challenge is, what do we need to do that's different in order to sustain economic growth into the future? And that's, of course, where education comes in. Now, the question asked about, are there enough jobs in Vietnam? The answer is yes. Are there enough jobs for people with high skills? Again, the answer is yes, but with an asterisk. And that is that the growth in high skill demand, demand for formal educational credentials, right? That growth has not been as fast as the growth in blue collar labor demand, and that's the kind of problem that I was thinking about in this story here. Right? If you have a higher level of education in Vietnam, you can still get a good job, but increasingly it's one of two kinds. It's either a traditional job in the government or in a state-owned enterprise where the credential is required, even if the skill demand of the job doesn't match the credential, right? That's kind of a separate problem. Right? Or with your higher skills, you can work in a dynamic sector such as real estate, but you don't really need skills for that. You know, the kind of skills you need are not taught in higher education so much. Okay, a business degree, but almost any business degree will do, right? What you really need is entrepreneurial flair and some non-cognitive abilities that allow you to spot opportunities and take advantage of them, right? Take risks and do things like that. And so, you know, if you're in Vietnam and you really want to get a good education, what are you going to do with that education? Work for government, work for a state-owned enterprise, take your other abilities and go into private sector where the formal credential doesn't really matter that much, or indeed, as the questioner asks, you export yourself.
Yes, right. Yes.
Because of course, you know, if you can get into a rich country labor market in Japan or in the United States or in Europe, then, you know, the returns to that are very high.
But how is the situation of labor breeding out of the countries at the moment for Vietnam?
The children of wealthier households increasingly go abroad for their education, which is something that I think is very familiar to Thais as well, right? And then what I can't tell you, what I don't know, is the rate at which they then return to Vietnam, right? That's something that I would have to look into the data on.
But do Vietnamese government provide any scholarships for them, and then have some commitments that when they study abroad and come back and work with the Vietnamese government or any universities?
Yeah, similar to the Thai system.
Yeah, right. I just was saying that.
Yes, I guess those exist, but I don't think they're very big. At least at this point, right? Most of the Vietnamese students that we see coming into the US educational system at graduate level are coming either privately or with, you know, some limited amount of support from their institution, not from the Vietnamese government so much directly as maybe from their university or from their employer.
So you finally got the answer for the middle income challenge. Middle income challenge, not the trend. Thank you so much for the question. And then I think actually the education will have influence and impact on all sectors, and it's long term. It's not just short term. It's not only immediate effect. It will particularly reshape the economic structure of the countries. And I'm glad that you have done this research and share with us. Have you also conducted such a similar research for other countries like the Philippines, Malaysia, and have the similar results?
The work that I reported today is a collaboration with a Vietnamese graduate student that I'm working with. I also have a Thai graduate student, a very smart guy, and he's doing very similar work in the Thai case. So in that case, his focus is on the way in which Thailand's trade relationships with especially Northeast Asia and most especially China are changing, and what that means for the structure of skill demand in Thailand. So that's a very interesting study, which is a kind of a version of what we're doing here, but somewhat different motivation, but very similar kind of story. So the Thai labor force survey data, which I showed in my talk, were compiled by Varan, by that student. I also have another graduate student who's Korean, and I'm learning from him because he's looking historically at the Korean experience of industrialization and the link, in a very interesting link in that case, to an educational quota system which applied in Korea. So in the 1970s, Korea limited the number of places available in colleges and universities. They had a quota.
Yeah.
And that quota was intended, just as you mentioned, Kyria, to ensure that there would be adequate growth in the labor force. But of course, what that meant was that there weren't enough engineers or technicians or mechanics to fulfill all of the demand in the system. So he's looking at a very interesting case in which the quota was relaxed, which happened at the very beginning of the 1980s. And we can see how that changes the composition of industrial production and the skill level of industrial production all the way through the Korean economy. It's a very interesting study.
Yes, truly. And I hope that in the near future, we can have some collaboration work with Thai scholars, and particularly focusing on the education and the role of education in our Thai economic development.
That would be great.
Yes, perhaps some scholars, some faculty members, and also students, your students, we may think about some interesting topics. You posed a number of interesting topics today, I think. A lot of challenges, right? And in fact, in the Thai education system, particularly for the universities, we are moving very fast now, but still not as fast as the world is moving.
Yes.
We try to catch up. For example, there are new courses, but still there are a number of standard requirements or the curriculum design, right, that needs to fit with the regulations. So what we have to do is to think about more pedagogies and the learning supporting system so that we can accommodate children to catch up with the globalization and more dynamic situations, right? Yeah. So I think we learned a lot from Professor Ian Coxhead, and there are a number of interesting issues that we can work on in the future. And hopefully that we, PSDS and also Thammasat colleagues and the public will learn more from the future publication that Professor Ian Coxhead will produce to us and add more the food of knowledge for all of us. All right. So thank you very much. Ian,
thank you very much.
Thank you all the audience here at the School of Development Studies. Thank you the audience at home, and also thanks for the comments and questions. And the PSDS talk will continue regularly. And please look at the PSDS Facebook and also the website. We will have this kind of platform so that we can share interesting and update knowledge on development studies related issues. Right. Thank you so much, and looking forward to meeting you again.